the forgotten sibling from Nintendo's launch day Zapper lineup, on this 7th episode of Good Intentions. The Nintendo Entertainment System debuted along no less than 3 light gun games on day 1 in the US, games that had been rolled out in Japan the previous year, one at a time. Of the trio, Wild Gunman has the strongest general pop culture foothold thanks to its prominent role as a Chekhov's gun, or rather Chekhov's light gun, in the second Back to the Future movie.
Hey, just tell me one thing. Where did you learn to shoot like that?
7-Eleven.
Meanwhile, Duck Hunt remains best known among dedicated Nintendo fans thanks to its amusing personality, enduring cast of animal characters, and the fact that it was packed in with various versions of the NES hardware up until the 90s. But what of the third game? What of Hogan's Alley? Does anyone even remember Hogan's Alley? Does anyone care? The third of Nintendo's internally developed light gun creations, Hogan's Alley suffers from 2 problems. 1, it lacks much in the way of a personality, and 2, its play mechanics feel like a half-hearted fusion of Wild Gunman and Duck Hunt. It doesn't really stand apart from its predecessors. The game, of course, takes its title from a long-running tradition of law enforcement firearm training grounds called Hogan's Alley, in turn a reference to a 19th century comic strip by the same title. Hogan's Alley wasn't just an early comic strip, by many accounts it was the first comic strip. Written and illustrated by Richard F. Outcault for the New York Journal, Hogan's Alley commands quite a historic legacy. It was produced under the auspices of luminaries like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. Hogan's Alley standardized word balloons as the container for spoken words in comic art, and its breakout character, a bald, gnomic child called the Yellow Kid, not only became the first comic star, but gave the world the term yellow journalism thanks to his association with Hearst's politically subjective approach to news coverage. So really, considering the roots of history and cartooning behind Hogan's Alley, there's a certain irony in the game by the same title having such a less than memorable personality. Hogan's Alley simulates a shooting range, one in which players strive for quick decision-making more than total accuracy. Rather than using paper targets that reward shooters for precision shots, Hogan's Alley uses 6 different cutouts of people. 3 targets depict various gangsters, including a street hood in a bomber jacket and a Prohibition-era mafioso in a pinstripe suit, while the other 3 depict good guys: a beat cop, a civilian lady, and an elderly professor. Your task is to take out the bad guys as quickly as possible while trying not to kill the innocent targets. In the game's A mode, you're presented with 3 targets at a time. These slide onto the screen facing sideways, so all you see initially are 3 identical narrow lines. Once they take their position, the targets flip to face you in tandem. You have just a second or 2 to identify friendlies and foes, take aim, and shoot the gangsters. So the challenge basically amounts to the secondary mode of Wild Gunman, in which you have just a brief instant to register which cutouts are valid targets. Hogan's Alley gives you 3 possible choices versus Wild Gunman's 2, but otherwise it's functionally identical to the other game. More interesting is the B mode of Hogan's Alley, which livens things up considerably. Rather than taking place in Mode A's standard firing range, Mode B puts you in the eponymous alley, scrolling automatically along a simulated town in which the character cutouts appear more chaotically. Here, the targets and civilian effigies alike can move along rails while you yourself are shifting along. They can appear along the streets, through windows, along balconies, and within structures, sometimes coming into view turned sideways and sometimes facing you. This mode is by far the more challenging and entertaining of the 2 thanks to its variety and unpredictability. It can also be incredibly difficult, as some of the gangsters give you as little as half a second before they fire on you, an incredibly narrow window in which to parse the nature of a target, take aim, and open fire. And per usual, Hogan's Alley has a radically different third mode. In this case, a trick shot mode in which you shoot tin cans to cause them to bounce through the air and hit different ledges, which are worth varying amounts of points. Once you begin juggling 3 or more cans at a time, this mode becomes remarkably challenging. And that's about it for Hogan's Alley. Perhaps the most interesting thing you can say about it is that a year after the NES's mainstream release in the US, the FBI opened a target training facility called Hogan's Alley that closely resembled Nintendo's. Though, given the legacy of the nickname in law enforcement shooting ranges, that's obviously just a coincidence. Before we close the book on NES light gun games for the year 1985, though, it's probably worth exploring just how the Zapper worked. Despite the fact that everyone always calls it a light gun, the Zapper probably didn't work the way you think it did, and the specifics of its technology explain why it doesn't work on modern TVs. As we've seen in the Wild Gunman and Duck Hunt episodes, the Zapper was inspired by Nintendo's Kosenju SP target shooting toys. But those guns, and the ones Nintendo equipped in its laser clay shooting system installations, truly were light guns. They fired narrow beams of light that would register a hit if they struck a small sensor. In the case of the simple Kosenju toys, you fired directly at the light sensors, whereas with the projection-based games like Duck Hunt, you'd actually reflect the beam of light from the wall where the targets were projected, and score a hit for good shooting, thanks to the physical nature of light itself. However, this was not how the Zapper worked. After all, what good would it do to shoot light beams at a television? A TV can't register light input from its screen. No, rather than actively fire light, the Zapper would passively read it. Inside the barrel of the gun, Nintendo built a light sensor. In other words, they put the target inside the pistol. This may seem an odd and backward approach, but it was a brilliant way to simulate arcade light gun tech with standard consumer-level televisions. Rather than force you to, say, position a sensor bar on top of your TV like later consoles would, the Zapper instead could read the TV display, at least on a simple level. Now, the Zapper contains some fairly basic technology. After all, it was first released in Japan in 1984, and it had to be affordable, so it's not like it was reading every pixel of the screen. Instead, it could determine the relative position of simple targets, and it could distinguish between individual frames of 60 MHz televisions. And that was enough to work. When you pulled the Zapper's trigger for a game like Hogan's Alley or Duck Hunt, the NES would cycle through a few frames of specialized animation. This happened so quickly as to be nearly imperceptible. After all, the NES was running at the same 60 frames per second standard that modern game tech snobs demand. 3 consecutive frames of animation amount to 1/20th of a second, meaning the Zapper's mechanics passed by so quickly, it would almost seem like you imagined them. When you pull the Zapper's trigger, a few things happen, depending on the game. For a few frames, the screen changes to transmit data to the Zapper. When you pull the trigger in Duck Hunt, for example, the screen blanks entirely to black for 1 frame. On the second frame, the duck sprites are replaced by white boxes. The third frame restores the background, but not the ducks, as the game takes that frame cycle to calculate hits and misses. When the duck sprites do return on the 4th frame, they reflect your success or failure. If you missed, the duck keeps flying around, but if you score a hit, the sprite becomes a stunned duck, plummeting to the ground. In Hogan's Alley, the cycle works a little differently, but the principle remains the same. The first frame after pulling the trigger is solid black, but the next 2 frames cycle through different sets of white boxes. 1 frame for the enemies, a second frame for civilians. The game cross-checks to determine which frame, if any, shows a target dead center in the gun sensor. If your direct hit registers on the bad guy frame, you win. If you took aim at a civilian, though, you lose. Meanwhile, Wild Gunman's A mode didn't use this frame cycling at all. The game didn't judge for accuracy in the one-on-one shootouts, just speed. So as long as you pulled the trigger in time, you'd win. For its other modes, though, the game used similar principles. The targeting frames where the white boxes replaced sprites in these games were essential, as they registered the accuracy of your aim. But just as important was the black initial frame, which served as an anti-cheat measure of sorts. The Zapper lacked the ability to properly resolve pixels, or to determine exactly what the bright light at the center of the sensor was. It would have been entirely possible for players to trick the Zapper by simply pointing at a light bulb for the duration of the game, causing a bright object to sit at the center of the sensor. By introducing a single frame of pure black, though, Nintendo's designers made that impossible. If the Zapper doesn't read a blank screen after seeing a target, the game knows you're cheating. It's a brilliant built-in test, but it also means Zapper games don't work on modern TVs. They're designed for the immediate, responsive displays of CRTs, not lag-ridden LCDs and LEDs. The upscaling process that NES graphics have to undergo for display on an HD TV introduces a frame or 2 of lag under the absolute best of circumstances. And even if you're playing with an HDMI modded system, you still have to contend with the inherent lag of flat-screen televisions, which, again, under the best of circumstances, is going to be a frame or 2. A couple of frames of lag might not seem like a big deal outside of fighting games, but Zapper games are programmed to expect certain signals at very precise times. If the light gun doesn't see the sequence of on-screen indicators it expects exactly when it expects them, it ignores the data that does come in. Nintendo has reissued its early Zapper games on the Wii U Virtual Console, adapting the Wii Remote's motion sensing technology to simulate the light guns, and that's great. But you're limited to playing a handful of games. For light gun aficionados, whether on NES or later systems that used more sophisticated technology, such as the PlayStation's GunCon, the only true solution is to keep a CRT television around for proper, lag-free shooting gameplay. These limitations of light gun technology also mean that the act of capturing Zapper footage for this series at the same level of quality as that of standard games has been anything but simple. I'm playing on a modified NES that outputs RGB video for an upscaler to convert to high definition, but I can't run the system directly into the upscaler. My upscaler and HD television add about 3 frames of lag to the equation, not so much as to compromise gameplay, but more than enough to make Zapper gaming impossible. So instead, the process goes like this. The NES sends video to a CRT, which allows me to use the light gun. The video then passes through the CRT, which is a high-end model that allows for both RGB input and pass-through output. From there, it feeds into the upscaler, from which it runs into a capture device that splits the signal to my computer and my HD TV for reference. This, of course, is a ridiculously convoluted setup, especially to play a fairly forgettable game like Hogan's Alley. But it really embodies the fleeting nature of vintage games and the challenges involved in keeping classics alive as mainstream technology evolves and leaves them behind. The Zapper, like many pieces of old game tech, was designed to create a clever illusion around a very specific type of technology, one that has not only been deprecated, but which is no longer manufactured anywhere in the world. Who knows, maybe CRT televisions will undergo a resurgence similar to that of vinyl records and suddenly go back into production again, but it seems unlikely somehow. So savor whatever time you can get with games like Hogan's Alley. Sure, they're simple, but someday it'll be impossible to play them accurately, except through emulation, victims of the march of technology. And that's the kind of killer you can't gun down in a simplistic law enforcement shooting range simulation. Next time on Good Intentions, Nintendo takes a run at the Pac-Man clone genre.